Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As we await their 5th anniversary, we ask, will we ever know the full truth of Pulwama? And secondly, how effective was India's Balakot strike? Those are two questions that are recently provoked by a book that's just been published. Here it is. It's called Anger Management, The Troubled Diplomatic Relationship Between India and Pakistan. And this book contains a critical chapter on Pulwama and Balakot. Its author is India's last High Commissioner to Pakistan, Ajay Bisaria. Mr. Bisaria was there when both Pulwama and Balakot happened. Joining me now to talk about Pulwama and Balakot is Mr. Bisaria. Mr. Bisaria, let's start with the terror attack in Pulwama in February 2019. You write, and I quote, Pulwama was in all likelihood a small operation gone out of control where the suicide bomber lucked out in getting an unprotected target in a convoy of vehicles. The general assumption of civil security experts was that this was an operation that had become bigger than was originally planned. It met with unexpected success. You seem to be echoing there what Satyapal Malik, the last governor of Jammu and Kashmir, who was there at the time, said to me in an interview last year. He said, the terror attack was a result of incompetence and laparwahi by the Indian system. Is that what you mean when you talk about the terrorist lucking out and meeting with unexpected success?
I make a different point, Karan. We were talking of what happened in Pulwama and talking of some of the contemporary conversations around that time, around Pulwama. And what was clear at that point was that there was an attempt by Pakistan to say that this was an incident which was mounted by a local or indigenous Kashmiri. And at that point, it did appear that a huge operation was not planned, but something that was smaller was planned. And that just became big because the suicide bomber happened to hit a truck which didn't have armor or a bus that didn't have armored protection. So I think what I would like to certainly underline is that I was speaking of the conversations of those times. And as you know, since then, there's been a very robust investigation by the National Investigation Agency over 18 months with a charge sheet that was filed in several 13,500 pages. And a lot more is clear on the basis of that very robust investigation on what exactly transpired.
Absolutely. Not only is a lot more clear, a lot more has also been revealed, which could be very embarrassing for the Indian state. Now, in your book, you use delicate and discreet language when you talk about an unprotected target in a convoy of vehicles. In the interview that he gave me last year, that was in April last year, Satyapal Malik revealed that the CRPF asked for aircraft to transport its Jawans, but this was refused by the Home Ministry. He also said that sanitization had not been done effectively. Are you implying all of that when you use the word unprotected?
I'm implying something completely different. What I am doing as an analyst and a narrator is talk about the situation that emerged when the terrorists struck, instead of an armored vehicle, a vehicle that was actually transporting army jawans. And therefore, the point I make is that the terrorists lucked out in hitting a target, which resulted in more casualties. I am not getting into the politics of protecting or not protecting a convoy. I think that's a different conversation. I'm simply making a strategic point about the intentions of the terrorists and the outcomes that that we saw later.
You're making a very important point, but it's the implication of the point that you're making that I would like to draw your attention to. You're saying that this was an unprotected truck in a convoy. It wasn't an armored truck, and therefore, in a sense, if it were to be attacked, it would be a sitting target. The implication is that in those circumstances, an unprotected truck should not have been used. It should have been an armored vehicle.
I don't make that implication at all. The point I am trying to make, I'm no security expert on moving convoys, but the point is that buses are used, trucks are used, and the point from a terrorist point of view is that they luck out in hitting a target which is unprotected, or which doesn't have armored protection, as against one which could have been armored and would have therefore resulted in less casualties.
You've used your phrase, they lucked out, several times. When terrorists luck out, when they meet with unexpected success, isn't that because of incompetence and laparwahi, as Satyapal Malik said?
No, I think that is your point, not mine. I would simply analyze, as an analyst, the outcomes. Terrorist incidents have taken place over decades. And you could make the argument that every time a terrorist incident takes place, someone has made an error in protecting the situation, or not in allowing that terrorist incident to take place. So I make a completely different point, Karan, than the one you're insinuating.
Satyapal Malik made a further point as well in that interview he gave me in April last year. He said there was a grave intelligence failure because a car carrying 300 kilograms of RTX had entered India from Pakistan and was traveling across the roads and villages of Jammu and Kashmir for 10, maybe even 15 days without being detected and without anyone knowing it was there. You don't actually make that point, but would you accept that that is another element that helped the terrorists luck out?
I think that is an element for the security establishment in Jammu and Kashmir to debate on what was done, and I believe several changes were made in all the security protocols since. But if you see the NIA report and the detailing of it, a lot of these explosives came from across the border, and I think that's the most significant point, perhaps in backpacks over a period of time, and then they were deployed in whatever way. So I am not a security expert to be able to say what could have been done to prevent this particular incident, but clearly there were security lapses which led to this incident happening. And I think you could make that argument for every terrorist incident that happens across the country.
Let's come to the government's response to Pulwama. You were High Commissioner in Pakistan at the time when Pulwama happened. Now, Satyapal Malik also says that when he shared the information with the Prime Minister that there had been serious lapses on India's part, he was told to keep quiet, not to talk about it. And he said he got the clear impression that the Prime Minister's intention was to blame Pakistan and derive electoral benefit for the BJP. I'm putting this to you because you were High Commissioner in Pakistan at the time, and you would have some sense of what the government's motivation behind its response was. How do you respond to what Satyapal Malik said to me?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on what transpired between you and another interviewee, but all I can tell you is that it was clear as day that Pakistan was behind this attack, that it was owned up by the Jaish-e-Mohammed immediately on that day. And what I have demonstrated in my book is the evidence and subsequently captured in the Pulwama dossier of that time, even without the benefit of having an 18-month NIA investigation, which was a very persuasive piece of evidence, not just for folks in India, but also globally to global diplomatic interlocutors, which made it very clear that Pakistan was certainly behind the attack. The Jaish-e-Mohammed was behind the attack.
What I really wanted to ask was, as High Commissioner in Pakistan, did you sense that the motivation behind the Indian government's response was to milk this for electoral purposes? That's the charge that Satyapal Malik, who was governor in Jammu and Kashmir, was making. I'm asking whether you got that feeling sitting in Islamabad.
Not at all. In fact, the feeling I had was that this was a huge tragedy that had visited us, but it was a familiar tragedy of it was another terrorist incident that had happened, which, all too often has characterized this relationship between the two countries. And in fact, I felt it was a distraction for India from an internal election process that was on. So my impression certainly at that point was that this was a serious terrorist incident, which really distracts India from what it thought was a priority at that point, which was the election.
And you never sensed that this was going to be used for electoral purposes?
No, I did not have any sense. I felt that this was being used or being talked about exactly as you would deal with a terrorist incident in non-election times. So I don't think there was any specific or different way in handling a terrorist attack that came from Pakistan. What may have happened is that in the public optics and then the conversations, that incident would get politicized. That is inevitable in the public discourse. In an election season, anything could get politicized. But I would say it was handled professionally by the security experts and the diplomats of the day, and the political leadership was in sync with all the recommendations.
Let's come, Mr. Bisaria, to India's retaliation at Balakot. You quote a statement made by the Foreign Secretary of the day, who said, and I'm quoting, "In this operation, a very large number of Jaish-e-Mohammed terrorists, trainers, senior commanders, and groups of jihadis who were being trained for Fedayeen action were eliminated." What proof do we have of this?
Well, this was the statement that was issued on the day, based on the assessment that was made by the security experts, the armed forces, the diplomats. And I see absolutely no reason to question it.
But do we have any proof of it? Is it simply an assertion made by the Indian side to back up their retaliation? Or can we actually prove that there were a very large number of deaths that we caused?
Well, this is a familiar debate that has taken place. I think it was based on a reasonable assessment of what happened. And I would only go with what the Indian Air Force said. And colleagues from the Indian Air Force said that they were set a task and they achieved those objectives. So I find no reason to second guess, this. There has been, I know, a lot of conversation around what exactly was the proof. I think I got a very good answer in one of the meetings where a senior security expert told me that, look, the objective then was to bomb the terrorists, not to photograph them. So I think I have no specific information on that issue. All I do know is that the security experts had an assessment, and I find no reason to doubt that.
You've accepted on trust what the Air Force said, and that's perfectly acceptable. After all, you were the Indian High Commissioner in Islamabad at the time. But in your book, you also cite the testimony of a little-known Italian journalist called Francesca Marino, who claims that between 130 and 170 people were killed. The problem is that, as opposed to Francesca Marino's testimony, major Western media like the BBC, Al Jazeera, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Telegraph have all reported that India didn't hit the target and didn't achieve very much. Why have you chosen to accept Francesca Marino's version?
Well, I only cite that version, just as I cite several other versions, just as I cite some diplomatic conversations and security conversations within Islamabad or in Pakistan, which I was privy to, which had a different conspiracy theories being talked about, that a certain number of people were killed, and those arrested in Pakistan were perhaps those people without photographs of those people were perhaps simply people who had been killed. So the point I'm making is I didn't know. I had no reason or no way of knowing more than what the Indian security experts and the Air Force and others knew, and therefore I only cite that as what I'd heard, and also cite a few conversations to give a flavor, some color, some granularity to the kind of conversations taking place post Balakot.
Let me put to you what many believe is the problem with Francesca Marino's version. First of all, she relied on a single unnamed source, and her article was published in an online magazine called Stringer Asia. More importantly, if up to 170 people had been killed, how come we don't have corroborating reports of funerals, of grieving families? And how come this hasn't been picked up by any other Western media or by Pakistani social media? Remember, Pakistan's official media would not have touched it. I can understand that. But Pakistan's social media, which when he was army chief was writing stories about General Bajwa's corruption, alleging that he'd earned up to 12 billion rupees, if they can be defiant as far as the army chief in their country is concerned, they would certainly have reported grieving families and funerals of 170 dead. But there was total silence, both in the Western media officially and on Pakistan social media. That's why people feel Francesca Marino's testimony is unreliable and unconvincing.
I do not comment on that either in my book or elsewhere. The point, Karan, I was making was a completely different one. I was simply citing some of the conversations, some of the evidence. I've said that I had no reason to doubt what the Air Force was saying, and that was, remember, initially. So since then, there have been no official claims or counterclaims. I think the more important point that I try to make after citing all this evidence is the strategic implications of Balakot. I think that is more an issue that interests me as an analyst, that it was a step where I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where, as Pakistani narratives go, that 1 crore was killed, or as other narratives go, that 100 were killed, and as even others say that 300 cell phones went silent. I don't know. I don't have any specific information on that. But the strategic point is that Balakot defined a moment, along with the surgical strikes of 2016, that India was willing to give a credible response to terrorist acts in the subconventional space. And for me, that was the biggest takeaway.
Would you accept that when it comes to the consequences of Balakot, in terms of what Balakot achieved, what we have is narratives. There's an Indian narrative put out by the Air Force. There are Pakistani narratives that you cited that some arrests made subsequently were in fact a way of covering up for deaths that had taken place. And we also have Francesco Marino's narrative, which is unsupported and sourced to an unnamed source. What we don't have is proof. What we have is narratives, stories, explanations, but no proof, no evidence.
Well, absolutely. I think in many such cases of skirmishes or of wars, people don't open up archives, particularly countries that have been attacked. So you don't know for sure. You will perhaps never know for sure. But what you need to have is credible narratives, credible evidence that you piece together and see what point you're making. And clearly, there are vested interests in telling one or the other narrative. But what I think we should be doing as a public or as analysts is putting it all together and going with the most credible one.
Now, Balakot, as you know, resulted in Pakistan's aerial strikes against India when it directly hit a MiG-21, forcing Wing Commander Abhinandan Vardhaman to parachute and bail out. Of this, you write, Pakistan captured an Indian pilot and violated the Geneva Conventions. Did they really capture him? After all, he bailed out, parachuted, and landed on their soil. And secondly, how did they violate the Geneva Conventions?
Well, the Geneva Conventions say, and this was not the first instance where a prisoner of war was taken, that a person captured by the opposing or the army or the armed forces has to be returned basis the conventions.
And he was, I think, within 3 or 4 days.
Absolutely. So
how did they breach the Geneva Conventions?
By the reference is that you should in keeping with the Geneva Conventions, return a prisoner of war. We saw a precedent.
But they did, Mr. Bisaria.
Absolutely, no one is contesting that.
So what is the violation?
So the conversation, if you see the book, is about when the pilot is captured, then Pakistan is asked, when they are releasing gloating videos of him being bloodied and so on social media, that the Geneva Conventions demand that if you have a prisoner of war, you return him, not make videos of him and start circulating them.
Did we really expect that they would be returned to us within half an hour of landing on their soil? He didn't really get captured. He parachuted and descended and landed on Pakistani soil. Did we really expect that within half an hour they would open Wagah and hand him back?
Well, I don't think anyone expressed that expectation, Karan. What was clear was that the pilot had to be returned. And if you go to Pakistani media and public domain conversations at that time, there were some analysts and others saying that the pilot should be kept in Pakistan and used to negotiate with India.
But he wasn't.
That is precisely the point I'm making.
Which is why I'm questioning, did they violate Geneva?
Did they violate Geneva? They would have. This is the point that was made to them. So in the end, they did not. So I don't make the point that Pakistan violated it eventually after the pilot was returned. But mistreating a prisoner is also a violation. But here, I think the more important point is that I refer to an episode of successful coercive diplomacy in getting a pilot back when there was a lot of conversation about keeping him as sort of a negotiating tool.
A lot of that chapter on Pulwama is about the coercive diplomacy, as you call it. Let's come to that. As tensions mounted on both sides, you make a lot of the fact that Pakistan panicked because it believed India had prepared 9 missiles for launch into Pakistan. Why would a nuclear-armed country panic at the prospect of 9 missiles ready to be fired? After all, Pakistan by no means panicked when an Indian missile was accidentally fired into Pakistani territory and landed on Pakistani soil in March 2022. If anything, their response was balanced, mature, objective, and very sensible. So, if that's the case, when a missile is actually fired accidentally and they didn't know it was an accidental firing when it happened, and they didn't panic, why would they panic? Because 9 missiles have been prepared for firing into a nuclear armed country.
Karan, the assertion is based on the evidence which I have presented in the book. There is much evidence in the public domain of the reaction. You might choose to characterize it with one word or the other. But if you see, the conversations around it, I think the media reportage of what a Pakistani MP said, Ayaz Sadiq, that there was a closed door session and he talked to Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi and Army Chief Bajwa being there, Imran Khan conveniently absenting himself from that meeting with the MPs and saying that Qureshi's legs were shaking and there was sweat on his brow, and he said, for God's sake, let this pilot go.
So you're relying upon one Pakistan MP who, perhaps for vested reasons of his own, claimed that the Pakistan foreign minister's knees were knocking and there was sweat on his brow.
So, Karan, there is a series. I have cited more evidence than just that. That is one, and I've deliberately tried to use evidence from within Pakistan, and as also of conversations between diplomats and of the Western diplomats who were having repeated conversations with Pakistan's Foreign Office. So I think the issue was not whether you want to describe it as panic or concern or worry. The issue really is that there was a credible threat of force, and in reaction to that, Pakistan decided to let the pilot go within a finite period of time.
I've read your chapter on Pulwama very carefully, Mr. Bisaria, and if anything, the details and the account you provide suggest that there was a certain amount of panic on the Indian side. You write, and I'm quoting you, India had activated multiple diplomatic channels to deal with the crisis. India was sending messages to Pakistan through the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. More importantly, the Indian foreign minister rang up Mike Pompeo, who was the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, and woke him up in the middle of the night. In his memoirs, Pompeo has written, India believed the Pakistanis had begun to prepare their nuclear weapons for a strike. None of that suggests great confidence on the part of the Modi government, and perhaps in particular on the part of Sushma Swaraj, who was our External Affairs Minister.
I think, Karan, you are free to draw up an assessment or based on the facts that I have presented. But I think you've conflated a couple of issues here. The citing of this evidence was done to demonstrate diplomacy. So I would call it successful diplomacy accompanied by or which was accompanying a credible threat of force that was given to Pakistan bilaterally. So there was a good deal of successful diplomacy around it. On the conversation between Foreign Ministers Sushma Swaraj and Pompeo, I have cited his book. And if you note, I have my own assessment was from Pompeo's memoirs, Never Give an Inch, is that perhaps the claim was somewhat exaggerated. Both.
Forgive me, I don't mean to interrupt, but are you saying she didn't ring him up at midnight and wake him up?
That she had a conversation is what I have cited Minister Sushma Swaraj as.
But would he lie to say that she woke him up in the middle of the night?
I'm not claiming that anyone lied. All I'm saying is the conversation took place. Pompeo has given a version and an assessment of the conversation that takes place. He says he calls up Pakistan's Army Chief Bajwa right after that, whom he calls the real leader of Pakistan. But I simply cite that conversation between him, whether how he interpreted the nuclear threat,
But
exactly.
he claims quite categorically that Sushma Swaraj, who woke him up in the middle of the night, believed, and I'm quoting now from his book, believed the Pakistanis had begun to prepare their nuclear weapons for a strike. If India really did believe that Pakistan was now prepared to launch a nuclear attack on us, it suggests we were the ones who were perhaps panicking and waking up the American Secretary of State in the middle of the night. And I believe at the time he wasn't even in the United States, he was on a foreign trip.
Absolutely. So I would put it very differently from the way you have framed it, Karan. The conversation that takes place between these leaders, and as an analyst, you're reading multiple memoirs, you're piecing together that history, you may feel that one or the other version is not a completely accurate kind of assessment of what was happening. In this case, Mike Pompeo makes a claim and gives his version of a conversation, which may not very accurately, in my assessment, report the conversation that may have actually taken place.
The truth,
That's
Mr.
a limited
Bisaria,
point to make.
the truth, Mr. Bisaria, is that the present Indian government or the previous Indian government, both of which were under Mr. Narendra Modi, will never admit that in ringing up Mike Pompeo when he's not even in the United States but on a foreign trip, waking him up in the middle of the night, and then saying to him, "We're very scared Pakistan's about to launch a nuclear attack on us," is a sign of panic. They'll never accept that.
I
And
think
yet,
there's a
it does
completely
translate
different
like that to the layman when he reads it.
Yes, so I think it doesn't translate like that. What it translates into, in my view, is that there was some very intense diplomacy accompanying the credible threat that India had issued. And, even in the conversation she has in Parliament, Mrs. Sushma Swaraj mentions all these conversations she was having globally. So there's a great deal of global diplomacy that is taking place, which is reinforcing, amplifying the message that India is sending, that India means business. And I think, you are free to interpret it in a different way, but I would interpret it as successful diplomacy.
Now, if I recall correctly, President Trump, who was in Vietnam at the time, fairly directly claimed credit for Wing Commander Abhinandan Vardhaman's release. He kept saying, "Good news is in the offing." And within hours, Vardhaman was released. Many people at the time would have said that that was a more credible explanation for Vardhaman's release than your suggestion that Pakistan panicked because of fear of escalation by India. In other words, Trump weighed in on Pakistan on our side and got the pilot released. It wasn't fear of what India would do to Pakistan that prompted Islamabad to release him.
Well, this is, if you put on your analyst hat and you have 5 variables, you might make the argument one is more important than the other. I am simply giving my assessment that there was a credible threat of force, which was available from India to Pakistan, amplified by several of India's partners, thanks to some smart diplomacy on the ground at that point of time, which produced the outcome it did. You might argue that, it was the Americans that was more important, or someone in West Asia. But I'm simply making the point that it was effective diplomacy that was accompanying this credible threat.
I suppose where we differ is whose diplomacy was it that was effective, India's or America's?
Absolutely. I would say it was India's, and there's no contradiction between the two, and certainly America's, of India's partners who had the same objectives as India did.
My very last question to you, Mr. Bisaria, will we ever find out the full truth about what happened in Pulwama or Balakot whilst we have a BJP government led by Narendra Modi? It seems to me that anything that suggests incompetence or laparwahi, as Satyapal Malik alleged, or anything that questions the alleged success of Balakot, as Western media and Pakistani social media have done, will never be officially revealed to us in India.
Well, I would question that assumption. I would say it will perhaps never be revealed because Pakistan doesn't open up its archives. Never for any of the wars, never for any of the skirmishes. So this is what is in the nature of warfare, of skirmishes, that not everything enters the public domain. And that is partly because you don't want the adversary to know all of your thinking, but also at the same time there is an interest in not making everything available. So I think
Pakistan's
the archives
archives Pakistan's archives may be critical in establishing the truth of the consequences of Balakot, although if there were no deaths, I'm not sure how the archives will help create deaths. But on the other hand, if there was incompetence and laparwahi behind Pulwama, that is unlikely to be revealed by the Modi government because it would incriminate them.
Well, the I think the whole point is that a terrorist attack took place in India and action was taken. You might debate what went wrong, and as I've argued, in for every terrorist incident takes place, something has gone wrong. The idea is to get back to the drawing board and see if your security protocols are smart enough not to let that recur. But I would simply make the argument that what India did was very professional in the way of managing a security crisis and also managing a diplomatic crisis.
Mr. Bisaria, thank you very much for the interview you've given me and for the time that you've spared. And let me once again hold up the book. Here it is. It's called Anger Management. And there's an awful lot more in this book than I was able to raise in this interview. If you're interested in understanding the 75-year relationship between the two countries, between India and Pakistan, this is the book that I recommend you should read. Mr. Bisaria, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.